everybody, and welcome back to the Sunday Shot. Apologies, we were a minute or so late.
3 minutes.
Well, we're having a few tech issues with poor old Andrew Fowler, but our producers are working behind the scenes to try and fix that. So I'm sure that imminently we will be joined not just by the wonderful Emma Shortis, but Andrew as well. But yes, our guest today, Emma Shortis, who is the expert on all things security and for the Australia Institute. And Andrew Fowler is there, that black screen. He can hear us, but he can't contribute just at the moment. So hopefully our producer BT will be able to sort that out. Welcome, Emma. Thank you very much for joining us on the Sunday Shot.
Hey, Joe. Thanks for having me.
We might just get you to lean in a little bit towards your microphone because otherwise I know we will have lots of very swift feedback about our audio levels.
It's charmingly haphazard around these parts. It's all strung together with, string and glue. So
rubber bands and stuff and the rest of it. Now, look, we're going to before we get into our subject for the week, which is all things AUKUS and the chaos which is being unleashed upon the global order thanks to the crazy orange man in the White House. A quick summary of the WA elections that took place last night. Basically, the Libs got another belting. Things did not snap back in quite the way that they hoped.
They don't like them over there in WA. They only had 2 seats, right, to begin with?
They did, and it looks like at the moment, I think they've only confirmed a win of 2 in Carina and Nedlands, with Geraldton going to the Nats, but it is likely that they will pick up at least Cottesloe. So really not a great result for them at all. And the other big story was that Basil Zemplis, who was basically being touted as their great white hope, certainly by Kerry Stokes and everybody in the WA media, he looks like he will win now, but there was a moment where it looked like it was going to be actually a real challenge for him even to win that seat, which is one of the safest sort of former heartland seats for the Liberal Party. So must be disappointing for the Liberals over there today.
Kerry Stokes loves to put a lot of money behind disappointing men. I feel like that's it's kind of his work ethic. That's his philosophy. It's sort of what he does.
That is absolutely true. But whether or not that will be then enough for Zemplis to continue to claim that he is the rightful heir to the leadership, I think that would be, a difficult argument to make at this point.
Do they even need a leader though? They only have 3 or 4 seats.
I know,
I feel like it could manage itself, really.
Well, I don't know. There would be chaos. Do you think there would be enough disagreement even between 2 or 3 of them, let alone 4? But the other big story is the possible election, indeed probable election of a Teal candidate, local business owner in the seat of Fremantle. Looks like that Labor will lose that seat after Fremantle, having felt quite neglected, and the high street being one of those, every third window is shuttered and gone from being a very dynamic, lively place to struggling a bit in those ways that some of those high streets do. So that would be a really interesting result too. And the Teals also came pretty close for a while in Cottesloe, so against the Libs. So interesting results. Possible implications for the federal election, particularly I think Kate Chaney might be sleeping a little easier after these results. But we'll keep looking at, because as Anthony Green was saying last night, it was a very slow count. So there's still a long way to go before the final makeup of the Parliament is known. So on to our topic, though, du jour, which really is the one that had to be grappled with I think in a really kind of rigorous and forensic way. What the hell is going on geopolitically now that we have a rogue state, or that America has become a rogue state, if you like. Emma, can you talk, what we thought we'd do is talk a little bit about AUKUS as it was, what the ideas behind it in the first place, and then talk about, well, if it was a bad idea then, what the hell is it now? So the origin story of AUKUS, there's all sorts of different angles of which we could from which we could come at this, but perhaps if you can talk us through really how it came about after we had signed the contract with the French. The French thought this was going to be a brave new world of the Australia-France relationship, what it might have meant for us in terms of a more independent approach to certainly our region, but also globally, and then how it kind of went so horribly wrong.
Sure, and it has gone horribly wrong, hasn't it, Joe? Entirely predictably, I have to say. I think, you outlined the French submarine deal, which was a really significant deal for Australia, to, as you say, to, I suppose, enhance our relationship with France, which was also turning more towards the Indo-Pacific as well. So it was quite a step change in Australian defence policy in that it wasn't an agreement with the United States. And quite clearly there were people in the Morrison government and in defence as well who were pretty uncomfortable with that, who want Australia to be tied really closely to the United States. And so all of that noise about the French deal being, behind and over budget, while true, that is true almost universally of every single defence project we've ever done.
Every single defence project anyone's ever done.
Yeah.
It's how the entire industry works.
Exactly, defence is just not subject to the same kind of accountability that any other projects are. They are universally, I have a colleague who says any defence budget, you've got to at least triple it, and then you'll get close to what they'll actually be spending on, whatever it is. And of course, you can't guarantee that whatever it is works at the end of it either, generally, with defence.
It's already obsolete by the time it finally arrives.
Exactly, which is, going to be one of the many problems with the AUKUS deal. And so then we have this pivot to what was the Trump administration with the Morrison government, and this idea that Australia needed nuclear-powered submarines, which, is a debate that we can have, but, clearly there were powerful people who decided to pursue this, who negotiated first with with Boris Johnson in the UK and went to the US with this proposal. And Australia's been knocked back a few times around acquiring nuclear technology, but clearly there was an openness in the administration because of basically China hawks, and the sort of settled bipartisan consensus in the United States that China is an existential threat to American power. So that was the context, and it's kind of, it's lost now, but when AUKUS was announced back in 2021, it was described as the revival of the Anglosphere.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what it is, that really kind of encapsulates what AUKUS is about. It's a dramatic change in Australian defence policy. These submarines aren't designed to defend the Australian mainland. No. They're designed to go a long way from Australia.
Emma, is this really about submarines? Because it doesn't feel like it's about submarines. I'm not a defence expert. It feels like we're paying mafia-style protection money almost, and that's without guarantees, basically.
Totally, Dave. Australian foreign and defence policy for 70 years has been driven by a pretty craven desire to guarantee protection from the United States. So Australia will preemptively commit to American wars. We'll buy, spend as much money as we can on American defence material in order to try and elicit this promise that the United States will come to save us if we ever need them. And that is what AUKUS is about as well. It's about it's not just about tying Australia to the United States, it's about tying the United States to Australia and keeping them in the region. There's a whole history of Australian governments getting really angsty when they think the United States isn't paying enough attention to us or to our region. So that as well is a big part of the motivation for AUKUS. The submarines are kind of incidental. Even when the deal was announced back in 2021, there was no actual plan for how it would work. That came like 18 months later.
What's the psychology behind that, behind needing this big protecting force in America without any, I don't want to play things down, but without any substantial concrete threats constantly? I mean, no one said we want to invade Australia. The newspapers say everyone wants to invade Australia, but no one's actually said that yet.
No, that's totally true. Look, I think, Dave, it's a deep kind of cultural, historical psychology where Australia was founded on dispossession and genocide and has been driven by a fear ever since that people who don't look like our government are coming to steal what we stole. Like, that's a kind of crude way of putting it, but I think that is the psychology, and you can trace that back to our abandonment by the empire, by Britain in the Second World War, and then the seeking out of another great white protector. I don't think we can underestimate the racism that drives that desire for a faraway protector.
And in this instance, it's a very expensive form of racism, isn't it?
It's so expensive, David. It is kind of, it's almost impossible to conceive how much this will end up costing. The estimate for the AUKUS submarines is $368 billion. If you triple that, as you usually do with defence projects, I'm not very good at maths, but that's like, what, $1 trillion at least, for some submarines that we're likely never to see. This deal is so flawed that the likelihood first that the United States will hand over the Virginia-class submarines to us, which is part of the optimal pathway that they describe it as, is incredibly slim. The US president has all kinds of get-out clauses for that, so we're unlikely to get them. If we do, they'll come with some pretty significant conditions. And then, of course, there's the actual AUKUS submarines, which are supposed to be designed by Australia and Britain, and delivered by the British submarine industry, which also can't keep up with its own projects. So the way it was described to me once was that every link in the chain is weak. The question is just which one snaps first.
And there actually have been, just in the last couple of days, a lot of the senior Trump administration defence people who, whilst saying, we love Australia, it's nothing to do with Australia, but that the idea that they will give over these submarines when, as you say, they're so behind in building their own, that the only point at which they will hand them over is when they are ready, with all of theirs are ready, and they have entrenched their capacity, and that is just looking so unlikely any time within the next sort of few decades that, as you say, the chances of us getting these submarines are becoming smaller and smaller with every day, let alone every year.
Totally. And I mean, I think you have to argue, why would the United States hand over those submarines? Why it wouldn't be in their interests? And that's not a criticism, that it's the job of the US president to look after the United States in the best way that he sees fit, and so why would they hand them over? But I think my concern as well, Joe, is that if they do, if in the slim chance that they do, what conditions does that come with? They're not just going to hand them over and say do what you will. There would be an implicit understanding that we would hand them back, or we would be involved in whatever missions the US president decides that we need to be involved in. And so the way that would tie what's left of Australian independent decision making to a US administration is really pretty frightening.
And in terms of military strategy, submarines that we have and that exist seem more effective than ones that we don't ever have and that don't exist. And no one on TV seems to want to ask that question. Yeah?
Yeah, look, I think it's that straightforward. There's the defence policy in Australia is so locked up. You're not supposed to talk about it unless you have a kind of deep, intricate knowledge of how nuclear-powered submarines work. But it is that simple, Dave. The Collins-class submarines that we do have are really old. They need a whole, basically they're getting a life of type extension, which means a complete overhaul so they can operate beyond when they were supposed to. That hasn't even started yet. And so the likelihood that this deal leaves us with nothing, with no submarines, is actually really quite high.
In terms of sorry, Joe.
No, you go.
You mentioned this before, Emma, about the types of submarines that we're and that these are not great for protecting shallow waters around Australia. This is basically what Paul Keating said at the press club, that these submarines are specifically designed for, let's say, well, I don't want to name anybody, but just sort of hanging around China, maybe, hypothetically.
Yeah, maybe.
I think one of the other interesting geopolitical things was that coming out of Boris Johnson's memoirs was that he argued, or he said blatantly, that part of the reason that he embraced AUKUS was just to fuck over the French, to get revenge on Macron and these very unserious people that we had. We had Johnson in Downing Street. We had, of course, Morrison here and Trump in the White House at the time, and in the early stages of the development, not by the time it was launched. But very unserious people playing stupid games with issues that were going to have extraordinary long-term effects on our geopolitical strategy, relationships and security.
I mean, to be fair, quickly though, the English have operated on that "let's fuck over the French" principle for a couple of hundred years. Like that's how they do things.
That is the way they do things.
Yeah, men and their feelings, hey?
Yeah. So look, I think we can just note that it was an appalling error on the part of the Labor Party to sign up for AUKUS within about a minute and a half of hearing about it in order to avoid a khaki election, and then not to announce some kind of review of it once they got into power. Part of that is that there are so many people on the Labor front bench who just love America generally, but it just seemed such a superficial approach to one of the most significant issues, and it's no wonder that people like Paul Keating are apoplectic about it. But I think what we can perhaps move on to now is that if it was a bad idea generally and really undermined an independent Australia and the sorts of relationships that we had been developing within our region, now that we have Trump in the White House, the geopolitical ramifications of what's going on there make it an even worse decision. Perhaps if we can just talk a little bit about the last couple of weeks and the way Trump has unended the world order. We've already talked a bit about on the shot how it's no longer really a rules-based world. We've just got strong men trying to do deals that they perceive to be in their interests. But it is reshaping the Europe. We've already seen the UK start cleaving closer to Europe, and that too will have implications for AUKUS as the Brits start looking to Europe again for their security. And then this week China entered the chat about everything that was going on, particularly around Ukraine. Can you perhaps talk first a little bit about Europe, Emma, and how they've had to respond so quickly to essentially the American betrayal of Ukraine?
And it is, I think we can't, Joe, underestimate the depth of the betrayal. We knew it was coming. Trump and JD Vance in particular have been signalling this for a really long time, but the depth of it and the humiliation with which it came, I think, was extraordinary. To watch 70 years of European security kind of disappear in the matter of moments was extraordinary. And it is that big. I think instinctively people could see that what that meeting meant, could feel how significant it was, and it is. But I think Europe, the way Europe is responding is quite extraordinary. To have the incoming German Chancellor, who is a Christian Democrat, like a conservative, say that, it's clear that the United States is indifferent to the fate of Europe and we have to chart our own independent path. And then to literally say, I cannot believe I am saying this, but this is the situation we're in. That is extraordinary. So the reaction from Europe is really significant, and it's happening on the ground too. So polling in France, for example, has suggested that a huge number of people, a majority, I'm pretty sure, now no longer see the United States as an ally, and that's reflected in Denmark, unsurprisingly, given what Trump said about Greenland. So the ground is shifting really quickly there in Europe, and this may well be the thing that finally pushes Europe towards a kind of unity on security that has been talked about for such a long time, and which the United States has often actually been a block on. So the withdrawal of the United States, as horrifying as it is, may be an opportunity to reset European security in a more sustainable way. But the way that happens is potentially really dangerous because, for better or worse, Europe has relied on American security and American defense material for such a long time. And of course, we see that happening in Ukraine, which is reliant on US aid that has been paused. So what emerges out of all of this is very, very difficult to predict.
How significant are the outliers in Europe, Turkey and a few other states that probably align more ideologically with the weird new bloc of Russia
Yeah,
and the United
Orbán in
States?
Hungary.
Yeah. Is that going to play much of an impact in Europe's response to this?
Look, I think it will, Dave. You know, Hungary's the other outlier
Mm.
as well. Of course, the American right absolutely adore Hungary and the resurgence of the far right in Europe more generally. I think I would take heart from the German election result, in particular French election result as well, to say that, you know, Elon Musk's kind of support of the far right is not having the cut through that he would hope it would. But how, I think the question probably is how the Trump administration manages those relationships with Turkey, with Hungary. And there are people in the administration who understand that landscape quite well, and have their own agendas. So they will certainly seek to use those countries, those outliers, to continue to divide Europe, because of course it's in Russia's interests that Europe is not united, and
Hmm.
it increasingly appears to be in the United States' interest, or in Trump's interest, that Europe is not united either. So certainly they'll seek to exploit those divisions.
Although it is, I mean, Hungary really he is an outlier, as you say. They are outliers. I mean, it was, I think the EU kind of voted on this, on issues around Ukraine, and it was unanimous except for Hungary. And Andrew has entered the chat. Yay!
Huzzah. Welcome, Andrew.
Welcome.
Fine. Good to be
So,
here.
were you able to hear the discussion that we've been having, Andrew? Some of
Well,
it.
as a matter of fact, Joe, it may surprise you to know that I was spending a lot of time trying to work out
No,
the
indeed.
Google
I know
Chrome.
that very well, being distracted. So, look, we're just talking about the way that Europe has had to recohere, if you like,
Yeah.
because of the way that Trump has unended the world order. I'm just going to perhaps move to China now, because this week there were a number of key speeches that were given by different representatives of the Chinese government who were very critical of what's going in the US. Now, some of this was triggered by the tariff issue and the trade war, which is coming,
Yeah.
or which is upon us, really.
Yeah.
But it
Yeah.
is interesting as well when they start talking about, you know, big countries shouldn't be able to tell little countries what to do. We don't believe in hegemony. We don't believe in bullying. I mean, these remarks can be interpreted in lots of different ways, particularly given, you know, the potential flashpoint around Taiwan. Emma, do you think that the way that Trump has been behaving, indicating that he may ignore borders, boundaries, even sovereignty of countries, if he wants to go in and seize Greenland, for example, that he's going to let Russia seize Ukraine if he can, will that embolden the Chinese around Taiwan? Or is that a bit of a distraction at the moment when we've got, you know, so many other things going on and no real indication that there's any military campaign likely in the near future?
Yeah. I think it's important to start with that there is no indication of any military campaign in the immediate future. I think there tends to be a lot of hysteria around this discussion that's often not based in the actual fact about the Chinese regime's intentions. I think we have to be careful about how we understand the example of Ukraine, because I think it's not as straightforward that, you know, strong men see that Putin's got away with this and so they're going to do the same thing. I think Xi in China, and particularly the Chinese regime, have a much longer view of strategy and history and will act in their own interests, but are also very careful. You know, I don't think that they'll necessarily act rashly because the US administration has done this. I think potentially the biggest shift there is around Americans are obsessed with credibility, with their own credibility. But this isn't an issue, I think, particularly now, given the depth of the betrayal that we were just talking about, where places like Taiwan, South Korea is another, are having to reconsider what they've based their entire security and defense policy on for decades, because it's clear now that the United States won't necessarily do what it has said it will do, that it won't necessarily defend Taiwan or South Korea. And that was always a little uncertain, but is now completely clear. And so I think that recalibration is what may shift things more than just a kind of simple, this is a lesson we take out of Ukraine. You know, I think the circumstances around Taiwan and China are so vastly different to Russia and Ukraine that you can't necessarily kind of just impose the same situation. But I think the withdrawal of American reliability, which, you know, was never perfect. Like, I think we have to be really careful about saying like this was all good and now it's gone, because it wasn't good. But that withdrawal of what was left, I suppose, of American reliability, particularly in Asia, is really radically shaking up, I think, how those individual countries are thinking about their own security.
Maybe we could sell them some submarines.
Because it is the case that, unlike, as you say, unlike anywhere else, like, so unlike Ukraine, Taiwan was relying completely on the US. There was no one else who would come to save them if China did become more belligerent and sort of start taking steps to reintegrate Taiwan into China. Andrew, the kind of extraordinary thing about all of this, and the way that all of these different nations are having to reconsider the way they've thought about their own national security and the broader global infrastructure and alliance frameworks, is how even America's closest allies are, it seems, almost particularly in the gun. And Canada has been kind of a really interesting example of that. And it was reported in the New York Times that in a phone call with Trudeau, Trump did actually say that he no longer accepted necessarily the borders between the US and Canada as being legitimate, and that he wanted to revisit them. I mean, this is the sort of the treaty, the border treaty from 1908. It must be quite a confronting thing. It would be as if New Zealand suddenly turned on us, what Trudeau is having to navigate with Trump.
Yes, and they're very near neighbours of the United States. They spend a lot of time explaining that they are not part of the United States, that they are North America, but not part of the US. The interesting thing for me, looking at that whole notion of the Canadian border and Greenland, is the passage, the shipping passage that runs through to the pole, and whether or not, and the strategic interests that the United States would have in that. That to me is like one of the keys to that whole geopolitical area. And the person that controls, particularly as the pole starts to melt and the passageways become more open, that's open then to shipping across from Russia and from China. So the interest in that area is purely about a strategic grab, as it is for the Panama Canal. And to complain that the Panama Canal was sold by Carter for $1, and not to understand that the Panama Canal was actually carved out of land stolen from Colombia, is a misunderstanding of what history is all about. But then again, Trump doesn't seem to pay any attention to history or to facts for that matter. I mean, and for Australia and how we should now view the United States, it's like, I remember a report that was written just after the AUKUS fiasco, and the report was that bridging thing before we decided to go down the path with Stephen Smith and the other person who wrote it with him. And they talked about how America would be the unipolar leader of the world for as far as we could see. And there was no evidence of that, and all the evidence was that this was an empire in decline, and yet we've gone along with that. So although we're a long way away from the Canadian border, we suffer the same geopolitical consequences of relying too much on the United States. I think that's a major problem that I know the government's not talking about it. I'd like to know what they're talking about in the Defence Department this morning or yesterday afternoon or Friday evening down the pub. What were they talking about? What were they thinking about how our future lies in our relationship with our forever friend?
At least outwardly, there seems to be this impression that the Defense Department, and indeed lots of the public service and the government, is full of very pro-American industrial complex, just at all levels of government, really. And I do wonder as you say, what those conversations sound like nowadays.
Yeah, I mean, it's the thing that Australia has hung its hat on since the war, being defended by the United States. I mean, the Prime Minister made an unfortunate error in talking about how ANZUS was like NATO, and attack on ones, attack on all, that we would rely upon the Americans. I mean, it was such a gobsmackingly ridiculous error to make, and yet it's part of the sort of psychology, the political psychology of Australia, that America will always come to our aid. And I think the problem, we actually should turn it around and say, do we really need America to come to our aid? I think they may be more of a problem than a solution to the problem.
That's exactly it. It feels like, I mean, if we're going to end up in a global conflict at some time in the next indefinite while, it does now feel like any conflict will be because America started a conflict. And why are we throwing our hat in that situation?
Yeah, and I don't worry so much about Taiwan. I mean, although you probably can worry about it if you want to. But the trade issue is what it's all about. I mean, the reason that we being Australia, are hosting the bases and the West Australia, the submarine bases in West Australia, is to throttle the Chinese and to stop them from rising to be a superpower like the United States. This is a trade war.
With our biggest trading partner.
That does cause complications, you're quite right, yeah.
Now, look, Bruce Wolpe is currently in the United States, and I interviewed him shortly after he'd watched President Trump deliver the first address to Congress of his second term. And I asked him to describe the mood of a nation transfixed, really for better or for worse, by their volatile leaders. So we'll have a listen to what Bruce has to say, and then we're going to come back and talk more specifically about what Australia should now do. Bruce Wolpe, welcome to the Sunday Shot.
Yeah, Joe, to be with you, the Sunday Shot, a real privilege. Thank you so much.
So you're over in the States at the moment. What's your take on the mood in the States at the moment, and how people are feeling now that he's entrenching himself back into power?
Thank you so much, Joe. If you're a Trump supporter, you're pretty happy with what's going on. I mean, that speech captured, it was Trump. It was the essence of Trump. And he laid out his program, what he wants to accomplish. He pushed all the culture war buttons that he has pushed for years. So this speech was, and it is the most powerful platform in the country, where the president speaks to not only the entire Congress, but to the nation and to the world. And it was his fifth. The last time he did it was 5 years ago. How time flies.
Yeah.
But it was a speech of exhilaration for him and outrage for the Democrats. And that exhilaration, outrage, that's just mirrored across the country. If you're a Trump supporter, you're really happy. Democrats are despondent. His approval ratings since coming into office have ticked down 2, 3, 4 points. Disapproval is higher than approval, 2, 3, 4 points. And so you have a bitterly divided country that I would say is essentially anxious about the future.
I mean, there has been some reporting that, the honeymoon is over. As you say, the disapproval levels are going up. But really, does that matter to Trump?
No.
Supporters?
Trump wants to get his program done. He actually doesn't care about the short-term political flack that comes with it. He knows he knows the future of America that he wants to craft, and he intends to, both at home and abroad, and he intends to implement it. And if he has to catch some hell on closing this department or that department, or firing these employees, or being rude to people, that doesn't matter. He's going to persist. He himself probably will not face the voters again. The voters will have their chance a year from November. So 18, 19 months from now. That is a long time. And he has control of the Congress while he's doing it. And so he is full bore. Look at the speed with which he's acting. He learned a lot from what stopped him from doing all these things in the first term. This is one smart, canny, and cunning man. And he is all in.
And that is the big difference, isn't it? Because having almost won accidentally last time, there was a lot of confusion, not much got done. There weren't people around who would ruthlessly implement the type of policy agenda that he had. But this time they've come in prepared with their Blueprint Project 2025, and they're just getting on with it. That's
right. And everyone warned for the past year, 2025, it's coming. Here it is in black and white, and we see it being implemented. But what was unexpected, and which has added a whole different degree, order of magnitude of power to it, is the alliance with Musk, making him Elon Musk the richest man in the world and now one of the most powerful. He's effectively the vice president of the United States. J.D. Vance is strong, but he's a shadow compared to Mr. Musk. And what Musk has done in seizing control of the internal networks of the bureaucracy is to be able to really ruthlessly slice through everything in terms of what these departments are spending, what these programs are, and then stopping them. And I think the classic example of that is stopping $20 billion in U.S. foreign assistance to poor countries around the world. And he has done that. Now, the issue really is, so what can stop Trump? There's only one right now, and that is the courts. And a lot of these key issues are before the courts, and I think there will be rulings against Trump. And then that leads to another issue. Let's say the court says, well, you have to restore, and it goes to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court says, yeah, you got to spend the money that Congress has appropriated. This is supply. And you can't just say, I'm not spending the money that is law. And so if Trump faces an order like that, will he obey it or disobey it? That is really the larger question, because all these attacks on the status quo, they ultimately come down to, do we have a democracy anymore or not? Is this one-man rule or not? Are laws of Congress that have been enacted, are they followed or not? The same with court decisions, and the same with how you use the military. So that is the essence of it, and this is why it is such an extraordinary time.
Trump did have a setback in the Supreme Court recently, where Roberts sided with the Liberals to say that they had to spend the US aid money for work that had already been done. So it's not a huge victory in terms of practical outcomes, but symbolically potentially important. With the Supreme Court itself so compromised in some ways, do you see that can be a bulwark against some of the more extreme measures?
It may be. The 5-4 decision with Justice Roberts, the Chief Justice, as you said, very important. But whether that holds, so he sent it back to the lower court, figure out how to implement this program and make your orders. Trump will appeal it. It'll come back to the Supreme Court in 2-3 months, and then we will see. But the institutions are being tested. The real tragedy here, as far as providing a check on Trump, is that the Democrats needed 5 seats to take control of the House of Representatives in November. They won 3. And so they're 2 seats short, and those 2 seats mean all the difference. Imagine if Democrats had control of the House, they chair the committees that have jurisdiction over all the aspects of government, and they can haul this cabinet secretary and that official to that executive branch official before them and say, what are you doing and what is your, and there's a guarantee that the Trump program will not pass the House because Democrats will stop it, just as they did when they had power against Trump in the last 2 years of his first term. So there we are, stuck. And it means that all of the power and all the inertia is with Trump. He will not be stopped from within. Where he will be stopped, given the absence of a countervailing power to take him on, will be if there's massive failure of his policies. Trade. He's on trade wars with everyone. And I want to talk about Australia in a moment because I think Australia is at risk. But if the trade wars and tariff wars with Canada and Mexico, the 2 biggest trading partners with the United States, along with China, if they cause rampant inflation and supply chain interruptions so that the economy is lousy by this time next year, that will stop Trump.
But that is likely, isn't it? I mean, if he goes
most
ahead,
economists think so, which is why the markets are going up and down, mostly down right now too. And so we've seen in the past few days, the markets go down and Trump says, oh, those Canada, Mexico tariffs, I may put them in effect a little bit later. But it's the volatility of his decision-making that is driving uncertainty and insecurity about the economic future. So again, Trump, by his volatility and chaotic administration, that is what will stop him most.
And as he's starting trade wars with his closest economic trading partners, on a broader strategic front, he's clearly changing sides when it comes to support of democracy, engagement with NATO, in ways which are really quite shocking for people who've been following, the last 80 years of geopolitical strategy and alliances.
I don't want to be shameless and plug my book on the Sunday Shot.
Oh, please go ahead.
Okay. It's what does Trump's second term mean for Australia is the book. But I wrote on Thanksgiving Day, I finished writing, and I said, it looks and feels like the 1930s all over again, doesn't it? And this is where authoritarians can invade other countries with impunity, and that you have trade wars and going on between the largest countries in the world, and you have nativism, fear of immigrants and so forth, and you're putting walls around your country. And that's exactly what happened in the 30s, and we know how that decade ended. And so we've been there before. And I guess, it goes back to, those who don't remember history are more prone to repeat its mistakes. Thank you, Winston Churchill and Santayana. And that is exactly what we see Europe working through right now. I think there's deep concern that Trump can call Zelensky a dictator, and that Putin is the victim of what Zelensky did against Russia. It's obscene, frankly, but it's still driving policy and so forth. So, I mean, what has Trump said to Zelensky? You want peace? Fine. First, pay us for what we did to you. Secondly, we're cutting off all military aid. And third, give us half the minerals in your country. And that's before you even get a discussion of, okay, what are the lines, and what country survives here? And I think it's immensely distressing.
Do you think that the rhetoric that Trump is engaging in around Greenland and the Panama Canal is real, in the sense that he actually has designs on that, and may pursue ownership of those two territories, reclaiming those two territories, or reclaiming the Panama Canal and seizing Greenland?
I think what we see is economic nationalism on the one hand, and all through we've been talking about as to where Trump wants to do on governments and spending and so forth, and a new American imperialism on another. That we're the biggest country in the world, we're the most important, we need this for our security, we're going to take it. And so I think Panama is in those sights. I think he definitely wants to annex Canada. I'll come back to that in a moment. And Greenland, absolutely.
So you think the Canada thing is real too? It's not just him trying to goad Trudeau. I do.
And so then the question is, on trade issues, is Australia the 52nd state of the United States?
Let's come to Australia. So what do you think really the implications of all of this chaos are for Australia, sort of generally, and then in this sort of febrile political climate coming up to the next election?
The relationship is solid, and below the White House level, I think Trump likes Australia. I think his default posture is Australia's a good country. He has people that he's worked with from Australia, Greg Norman and Anthony Pratt and others.
And we do have a trade surplus, unusually.
Well, yes. When he was informed again that Australia has a trade deficit with the United States, he kind of said, "Wow, that's really nice." And it was a very good conversation with Prime Minister. It was a promising conversation with Prime Minister Albanese. But as I've listened to Trump on trade issues, particularly with respect to Canada, where he has been very aggressive and determined to get his trade objectives with Canada. If he can do that to Canada, he can do that to Australia too. So it doesn't matter that we have a free trade agreement. It doesn't matter that the United States has a trade surplus with Australia. There are still a couple other things that are factored into the trade relationship, like the cost of GST on goods going to the United States, where with Trump, he always wants more. Oh, I have all these things. That's very nice. I want more. And so I now think, given the Canada experience, that on aluminium, steel, and perhaps a couple other items, there's going to be some punishment of Australia. And then I think the interesting question that comes out of that is, look at the reaction of the Canadian people to what Trump has done. In fact, it's resurrected the Liberal Party, right? I mean, they may.
Yeah, absolutely.
They're within 10 seats where they were down 50 in the polls. I think if he does something like that to Australia, I think Australians are going to be very, very angry about it. And I think that will have political implications in our country.
Well, the surveys that were done before the election were that Australia very strongly, like 74%, favoured a Harris presidency. So we were not inclined to want to see Trump returns, and now the chaos which is followed from that. And the very overt commentary from some of the Trump team that seem to be meddling in domestic policy. You should be spending more on defence. What is this PBS scheme that's disadvantaging American companies?
Yeah,
Leave our big tech companies alone. Those sorts of things.
Yes, but I do think it's going to be tense. Now, whether the trade issues are ultimately resolved or come to a decision point before the election, not clear, because he does tend to, when squeezed, defer things. We will see. But I think Australians, have been extremely concerned by just what they see as the news unfolds. And secondly, are beginning to appreciate, in this hostile world where he's betrayed Ukraine and is disrupting Australia's a trading nation. He's disrupted that order for Australia, that economic powerhouse of Australia. I think people have that 74%. I think it's now maybe it's even stronger than it was. The issue is America's democracy going to endure? Will it be a democracy next year if in fact he's disobeyed orders of the Supreme Court, has quashed laws passed by Congress, has put enemies in jail, has shut down media outlets that he doesn't like? If that happens, the United States is no longer a democracy. Now, why are we aligned? What are we aligned with? Why are we aligned with the United States? Because we share values. Well, what if he trashes those values? And so I think this discussion is going to go very deep across Australia, and it should.
I agree with you. I don't think any of our political leaders want to have that conversation.
No.
I don't know if it's because they're in denial. People like Richard Marles, their allegiances to the US go very deep, or if it is just at the moment a tactical thing of not having those conversations in public whilst they're really trying to work things out behind the scenes.
But there will come points where you have to differ.
Yeah.
So, and again, both the prime minister and the opposition leader have differed over Ukraine. I think that's really significant. But we're not. It's not a frontline issue for Australia. So we got to look at the frontline issues and see what happens. These are going to be tough days, tough months ahead, and I wish there was. I wish they weren't, but they're with us, and we got to live through them and come out properly and correctly on the other side.
Yeah. Well, Bruce, look, thank you very much for your insights from over in the US. It is going to be tense times, and hopefully we can have you back on to talk again as things unfold. So thank you for coming on the Sunday Shot.
Thank you. It'll be good to get home, let me tell you.
So there we have it. I mean, it seems we're relying on Greg Norman and Anthony Pratt to be our go-betweens between Australia and the US. Emma, given everything that Bruce has just said, and that there are going to be tense times ahead, and that that our alliance with the US was based on shared values, and those values seem to be just being trashed by Trump at the moment. What does it mean, given that we put all of our eggs in the AUKUS basket?
I mean, I think I would say, Joe, that nothing is inevitable. AUKUS is not inevitable. We don't have to continue down that path, and the ground is shifting really rapidly in Australia, and I think it's flown under the radar a little bit. So the Australia Institute actually did some polling this week that asked Australians about the United States, about the alliance, and about our security. And when asked if they would prefer a more independent foreign policy or a closer alliance with the United States, 44% of respondents said they'd prefer a more independent foreign policy. And in the context of Australian feelings about the United States and about the alliance, that's a pretty extraordinary result. And though that poll was done before the Zelensky meeting in the White House. Wow. So, I think I expect, given, what Bruce was just saying about how bad the Trump administration is and how bad things could potentially get, I expect that those results could get even bigger if we did that in the next couple of months. And what that says to me is that political space is opening up to, rethink, reconsider our own security and our relationship with the United States in a way that it hasn't in Australia, potentially for decades, potentially since the 1970s. And that's, I think, a real opportunity for us.
It's a real opportunity if you have the type of political leadership that has strength and conviction and really holds to their values. And is that where we're at right now, do we think?
Andrew, what do you think about that? Because I think this space could be opening up, but so far our political leadership doesn't seem that they're going to move in and take that opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you move from the theoretical and the philosophical and political So the actual reality of what AUKUS is at the moment, it is dead in the water as we speak. The Americans will not deliver the submarines that they promised to deliver. And if they do deliver them, they'll run them because we can't, and they need them. They can't produce enough for their determination to contain China. And of course, breaking news in the United Kingdom a few weeks ago was, of course, that the nuclear reactors inside the AUKUS submarines, which are the ones that will fill the gap after the Americans have or have not delivered their submarines, don't work and are unachievable. So the actual reactors themselves don't work. The UK is in a terrible pickle with its relationship with the United States. It's now, irony of all ironies, reaching out to the French to do a nuclear deal on how to keep their nuclear weapons available, because they don't trust the Americans to give them the weapons if they need them to act independently. So this whole thing has gone, well, it's going round and round, I think, down the plug hole. But the AUKUS, I just don't believe, is survivable. And not only is it the cost, but the actual deliverability of the hardware, which is really the submarine issue. So that, I think, is something that, who's going to break the news to the Australian public? Well, like that, it's not me.
Well, I feel like the Australian public is kind of clocking onto this as we get the example of Emma's polling results. 44% of people are a bit sus on this whole prospect. It does seem quite clear, doesn't it? Like, what is it going to take? We're playing this game where no one in leadership is acknowledging reality at the moment, and that's a dangerous space to be in.
Word to use, leadership. I mean, yet again, the Australian public, according to the poll, Australia Institute, is ahead of the politicians. We don't have leaders, we have followers. That's the problem, and we've had that for a long time. Unfortunately, that's just the way we're going. But I think that leaders that pick up on the essence of what the Australian Institute's done will be going, we can sniff the wind. We see maybe it's time now to start to ease our way away from the United States into a more independent Australia, which is not the views of, the sort of the left, the Greens, and people on that side of politics. It's also on people like Hugh White, Sam Modjaveen. I mean, these are serious thinkers, and I wouldn't put them in the political spectrum anywhere, but in the middle of Australia's political spectrum, although that's to the right of a lot of places that I know. So you've got that sort of consensus now building where people are saying, we have to do something for Australia individually, separately from the United States, particularly as we have what the ex-head of the USAF called and quite rightly so, I think, a rogue president in the White House.
Yeah. We are moving into an election campaign where normally you would think that issues of such moment for Australia would be honestly discussed, would be ventilated in a sophisticated way so that voters can make up their minds. But there is a silence. There is the consensus of silence between both of the major parties at the moment. They are, as Bruce commented, they are very strongly coming out in support of the Ukraine, but they're not taking that next step and saying, what the hell is going on with the US? We can no longer rely on the White House with this president within it, as Europe is having no problem doing, and indeed even China is coming out and saying. Emma, do you think that there will be any room for a kind of an honest discussion? I saw Zoe Daniel had an op-ed in The Guardian where she called for these sorts of things. Will there be pressure coming from the progressive centre and the left that will demand that our political leaders acknowledge the reality that's unfolding before our very eyes?
I think so, Joe. I was going to bring up Zoe Daniel's op-ed as well, because I think that that's really significant, when Australian politics has been so locked in that bipartisan consensus around the alliance, to have independents calling for what was essentially quite a radical rethink of Australia's relationship with the United States is really significant. So I think the pressure from outside to reassess our, common values with the United States is only going to increase as Trump continues kind of along his merry way. And I think that pressure is already having an effect. You mentioned Ukraine. The fact that Anthony Albanese has said that Australia would be open to considering supporting peacekeeping missions in Ukraine without the United States asking us to be involved, and in fact being involved, probably would attract some ire from the United States. It's it's small, but it's significant that the Prime Minister has created that space. And I think that's a recognition of how quickly the political ground is shifting. I think, you know, Dave's right. There's not necessarily an indication that there will be the kind of bravery that is required. But the fact that independents are intervening, and the fact, you know, you talked about the WA election results at the start of the program, the fact that there aren't really safe seats anymore, that's going to play in, I think, to how much politics could shift around this issue.
And ironically, it might be the fact that Trump is such a chaos merchant that we may be able to restart the kind of regional dialogue that had been, the trajectory we had been on under people like Keating, because everybody is sitting aghast. They might forgive us our ill-advised re-embrace of the Anglosphere because the world has shifted so much in the last, well, even, it's just a month since he's been here. It's like, oh my God.
Discombobulating
And
month.
do you think there might be opportunities as well in that regard?
Look, I think so, Joe. You know, I think that what Trump is doing is allowing us, hopefully, to have a conversation about what actually does make us safer. Yeah. You know, I think there's this recognition that these submarines were never really designed to make us safer, and that, you know, kind of, I suppose, alongside that, you know, the things that gave rise to Trump, things like vastly increasing inequality, insecurity at home, addressing those kinds of things, addressing climate change, are the things that might actually make us safer. And that does mean much more engagement, much more honest engagement in our region, in building that kind of regional security around addressing inequality, around addressing climate action. So I do think that space is opening up. It would be a radical change for Australia to think about security in that way, but it feels more possible now, at least, than it has for a really long time.
So you're saying we should actually fix the problems instead of paying for submarines we're not going to get?
I am saying that, Dave.
It's radical. That's wild.
Sorry, Joe,
Andrew, do you think that there is perhaps an opportunity here? And do you think that... you know, as we know from your book on AUKUS, Nuked, Wolpe award-winning, people rush out and buy it, that there remains embedded within the bureaucracy, though, very much China hawks and US supporters. Now, as you say, what conversations are they having down at the pub now? But will there be political will to overcome that kind of deliberate inertia from within the bureaucracy to open up the space and talk about security in the kind of different way that Emma describes?
Sure. I mean, I think the problem that you really have is, as you talk about the inertia in the bureaucracy, what you really have is the problem of authoritarian government, which was really what Morrison was all about, and he ran an authoritarian regime where everybody was terrified of the public service of speaking out. One way to overcome these problems in the future, to open up the debate, is to protect people in the public service who see a failure of due process and actually say, look, this is wrong, we should talk to the Senate or somebody about how this thing's going wrong, because we just splurged $368 billion if this thing continues, with no guarantee we're going to get anything back. And I think that the waste of money plays into what someone just texted up on the screen. They were saying, actually, it's not about AUKUS, it's about the cost of living. Well, AUKUS is about the cost of living. It's about the way in which government spends money. And it's about the waste of billions of dollars when people can't afford to feed themselves properly in this country. So those things do go together. The problem we have, of course, is that both parties are in lockstep on this issue because they're, again, fearful of being wedged on the US. Well, I think that fear is falling away, as the opinion polls show. So there is room for this kind of debate to take place, and it's really good that we're talking about it now.
Well, I think there's going to be a lot more talk about it in the lead up to the election. Now, we know that the election was not called this weekend because of the potential destruction of what ultimately became ex-Cyclone Alfred, but still causing a bit of mayhem from a weather perspective, which we know is as a result of the warming oceans, which is why Alfred behaved in the way that it did. So climate change again being brought to the forefront. So look, maybe the election will be called next week. It is going to be May though, so we will be on air with you for a bit longer. So please, when you see that QR code, don't hesitate to scan and throw in a few dollars so that we can afford to stay on for that extra month. Before we go, any top tips from any of you, things that are on your radar, whether from a policy perspective, a political perspective, or indeed an arts and cultural perspective? We'd like to hear it. Dave, you want to jump in first?
Well, yeah, just from an arts and cultural perspective, and we're arts, we're culture. I just want to say to the audience, we did an episode on submarines, and like if Greg Sheridan was ever going to appear, it would have been this week, and we didn't get him. So you can take that as a guarantee that this is a different type of show.
Andrew. Mike.
Republican.
There we go.
Yeah, that's
No.
not me. Someone turns it on from your end.
Thanks.
Are we on?
We are indeed.
Oh,
No. Let's stop.
No,
Oh, hang on. Can we stop that?
Okay.
Can we stop that, please? Denise, and can we go back to Andrew?
There's a very profound thought too coming up.
we need to hear it.
There we go.
Well, look, I think that in the Republican Party, they will have to make up their minds as the midterms approach, whether they're going to stay with Trump or go with the electorate. Now, the opinion polls that we've been watching, I've been watching them from American television, are showing that I think at one time 80% of the population said that they would vote for Democrats in the midterms. And that's because they're surveying the whole country and not just the people that voted in the election. So that sort of shows that disparity. It's a pretty big number, even if it's like 20% wrong. It shows that people are already turning away from Trump, and that's what the other opinion polls show as well. So as we move towards the midterms, the Republican Party is going to have to make up its mind whether it's more intimidated by the president or more intimidated by the electorate. And I would have thought that politicians being what they are, they'd be more intimidated by the electorate. So I think Trump will be in big trouble in the midterms if those opinion polls don't change.
Well, the Republicans are so intimidated by the electorate that they've actually banned Congress representatives from holding town hall meetings at the moment because the feedback has been so strong. And we've seen Congress representatives literally fleeing the meetings rather than engage with particularly veterans who are suffering a lot, if not, disproportionately from the DOGE swinging cuts. Emma, any top tips from you?
Yeah, sure. Just super quickly, Joe. Came across my radar yesterday that the Trump administration immediately cut off all funding for the Fulbright scholarship program,
Yes, I
which
saw
is a
that.
huge international. Yeah, and it's extraordinary. So 12,500 US citizens who were abroad had their funding cut off immediately, and about 7,500 foreigners in the States had their funding cut off immediately. In the scheme of things, I guess it's pretty small, but the way the Trump administration is trashing contracts and agreements, the way it is treating people, I just don't think you recover from that kind of betrayal. And those small betrayals are just adding up to something far bigger than the sum of their parts.
I think that's right. And there are also a number of special elections coming up, even before the midterms. So, who knows? It's going to feel, if every week feels like a year, November next year feels like a very long time ago. But the dynamics may change somewhat if we see strong Democrat resurgence in those special elections. Well, look, thank you everybody very much for joining us tonight, this afternoon, tonight. My God, we're all discombobulated about time at the moment. For joining us this morning, we've run a little bit over, but that's because we only got Andrew a little way in and we didn't want you to miss out on his insights. We'll see you next week. We'll be back next Sunday at 9 o'clock for another deep dive into the big issues that are confronting Australia in this election year. Thank you very much. See you next week.
Thanks for watching. Cheers. Let's play the outro again.
I don't think we have it, so we're just going to switch off. I've stopped it. That's all right. We can